Hello and welcome today to the Air at Cosmos studio, where we are lucky once again to welcome Nicolas Decaud. Hello, Xavier. Today we're going to talk about the confrontation, the rivalry between Airbus and Boeing. What do you know?
Exactly. Well, what I know about Airbus and Boeing is that I'm an investor. So I work at Clartemps Associates. I'm a financial manager. And we invest in listed companies, so potentially in aeronautical companies. And in this case, we are shareholders of Airbus. We are not shareholders of Boeing. I think that by the end of the interview, you'll understand a bit better why. As a result, when we look closely at Airbus, we also have to look closely at Boeing. And then, well, it's like a car driver. You have the one who drives the car without really knowing it. And then you have the slightly more sophisticated drivers who are able to open the hood and know all the bolts. So we are more in the mindset of diversion.
And let's specify that you are a graduate of Polytechnic and engineer, etc. So aerospace defense?
Yes, I really like aeronautics and defense. Plus, I was an analyst specializing in aeronautics and defense for years. Actually, I've been following the sector closely for more than 10 years now.
Closely? So Boeing, first of all, what's the story? They made aviation, they created aviation. I want to say they shaped modern aviation with planes like the Boeing 707, so up until the 90s, everything was fine.
So up until the 90s, everything was fine, absolutely. It's a good starting point, the 90s, because something happened. An important event was the merger between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. So McDonnell Douglas, I don't know if you remember, but the planes, the Douglas Commercial 8, Douglas Commercial 9, Douglas Commercial 10, they were planes that had an engine in the tail. So there were quite a few of them 20 years ago. I haven't seen too many of them in recent years. And so they merged the two companies in 1997. And that potentially explains quite a few things that happened later. It doesn't explain everything, but a number of things, especially on the cultural level. The idea was actually this. Airbus started gaining market share in the 80s and even more in the 90s. And to respond to that, the two companies said to themselves, we're going to merge together. We're going to save on costs, we'll have a wider range, and that will allow us to be better against Airbus.
They were two very technological companies that were good at what they did. On top of that, the advantage was that the smaller company being acquired from a European perspective also had a large military volume. Exactly, there was a large
defense portfolio at Douglas. They had the F-15, the F-18, the C-17 Globemaster. They made missiles. There was a huge volume of defense at McDonnell Douglas, and a civil aviation portfolio that was much more outdated. And in fact, none of Douglas's models survived, since from the new programs, the new program that was made is Boeing's 787 in the 2000s, so there, with teams from Boeing and Douglas. But all the others didn't survive. There are no more of them in the Boeing lineup. So then one of the things that resulted from that is that they moved the headquarters. So actually, historically, the chief executive officer of Boeing was in Seattle and could keep an eye on his factories, just like the chief executive officer of Airbus is in Toulouse today. And when they merged with this very scattered defense portfolio, the factories ended up being all over the place. There are some in Missouri, some in Arizona, and some in California. They thought they needed to be in a more central location, so they moved to Chicago. And personally, I think that from that moment on, they started to lose control a little bit. They lost sight of their Seattle factories, which are still the backbone of Boeing's commercial division. That's where they make all the 737s, all the 787s, and they used to make the 747s until recently. So for me, that's the first problem. Second problem, in the 2000s, as I see it, is the KC-46 tender. So the United States Air Force has the KC-135As, which are now very old.
These are tanker aircraft, just to clarify.
Exactly. The United States Air Force's tanker aircraft. Today there are about 400 in operation. And so the United States Air Force had a plan to replace them. They put out a call for bids and Boeing came up with one. So generally when you take a tanker, you take a civilian aircraft and modify it to turn it into a tanker. And here Boeing comes in with a modified B-767. At the time they were offering what they called the KC-767 and what we now call the KC-46. And actually looking at the specifications, I think they should have offered the 787. But the problem is the 787 actually didn't exist yet at that time, since it was developed in the 2000s and then it was supposed to go into production and into airlines at the end of the decade 2000, so 2009, 2010. And they had a huge number of orders. In fact, it was a very big
commercial success.
Right from the start. They had more than 1,000 orders, so they had, 10 years worth of back orders. So they said, let's offer a derivative of the 767, which is an older plane, which doesn't sell anymore. There you go, they still make a few.
Yes, but it hardly sells anymore already, but actually it's disappearing.
And above all, it's a plane that had its first flight in 1982, so it's a generation before the 787, which is smaller, doesn't go as far, basically, it's just not as good. On that note, Airbus thought there might be an opportunity because Airbus had the MRTT, well, Airbus still has the MRTT, and so a derivative of the A330, which is bigger, goes farther, and really just had superior capabilities. And so Airbus teamed up with Northrop Grumman and offered the MRTT, and in 2008, the United States Air Force said, MRTT is better. And then Boeing, furious contest, goes to court, starts over. Well, they say that the call for tenders favored Airbus. From where I stand, the call for tenders, well, obviously the United States Air Force wants a plane that's bigger, that can go farther, that can carry more fuel.
They favored the better plane. That's unacceptable.
But above all, there was an option. The other option was to make a derivative of the 787, which they didn't do, because in that case it would have cost them much more. Maybe they should have made a dedicated production line.
In any case, they weren't ready.
Yes, they weren't ready. No, for me, they didn't want to. They could have made a much better tanker. And so in the end, Northrop Grumman gave up, then Airbus gave up, and Boeing won in 2011. But for me, there's a little side to it. I suspect an abuse of dominant position in this case, and it's one of the signs that something was already not going very well. Then the second big problem, the consequences of which we still see today, it was in 2011 when Airbus went through a very dark phase. Actually, in the 2000s, since there were the big problems with the A380, which didn't get many orders, since it had 250 orders compared to the 787, which had 1,000 orders. And then there was the industrial boom.
From 2005 to 2008, let's also remember the moment when it happened. It was after the subprime crisis. The big orders, even for cargo, were cancelled. It was really a bad time. Technologically, it's a great success, just like the Concorde, by the way, but a commercial failure. That's what
Boeing was saying at the time, by the way. The second big problem for Airbus was the 400M, which also roughly cost Airbus 10 billion. Because the orders, actually, everyone agreed on 225 orders. And then as soon as the program was launched, a number of countries withdrew their orders, and then they had manufacturing problems. So as a result, it ended up costing about 10 billion.
And let's still point out that the big difference between Airbus and Boeing is that basically they make the same profit margin in the commercial sector, both of them. Except that at Airbus, the military side tends to create deficits, whereas at Boeing, the military side is the cash cow. Africa was, it's true, I'm talking about the 2000s. It's a
big military portfolio, but it's an aging portfolio. Because the F-15, F-18, those are old planes. The C-17 is an old plane. The Apache, yes, the Apache, there are only old programs at Boeing, except for the KC-46, but the KC-46 had industrialization problems, so it doesn't make them any money either. Also, it's a relatively limited series. We're talking about 180 planes. They would need more.
F-35, potentially, we're talking about
thousands. But even the B-21 Nordstrom Grosmagny, we're talking about around 100 units for the B-21. But it's a more strategic aircraft, and I think there's more potential on that side. So today, Boeing makes about 25 billion in revenue from defense. This year, we're expecting there to be an operating loss in the defense division and margins to recover a bit by 2027. But honestly, the cash cow from defense is over at Boeing. That was 20 years ago. If I go back to what I was saying, that is in 2011, the big turning point was when Airbus said it would re-engine the family, A320, A319, A320, A321. With two engines, the geared turbofan from Pratt & Whitney, which was the successor to the V2500, and the LEAP-1A from CFM, the CFM consortium, Safran General Electric Aerospace, which was supposed to replace the CFM56. And so actually they're making a bigger engine with a bigger fan, so it's more efficient, so it uses less kerosene per passenger. So that gave an aircraft that was cheaper to operate for the airlines.
And that creates a power dynamic because sales become incredible. So, and then
the best launch in history, exactly, a very, very good launch in 2011. And so Boeing is forced to react. And actually they have two choices. Either they start over with a completely new plane, which would have made sense because the 737 is still a plane that dates back to the 60s. Or they tried to do like Airbus with a re-engineering, which is what they ended up doing. So with the LIP, an engine, that's what we call single source in English, meaning a single engine. LIP-1B. But actually the fan of the LIP-1B is smaller, a bit less. The diameter is a bit smaller than the fan of the LIP-1A. And so the reason is that actually the 737 is too short on the pad, so you can't make an engine that's too big.
The changes from the 320 to the Neo were simpler than from the Neo to the MAX. Yes, because there was more space.
And the original design was more recent. So actually we had planned...
We could adapt it more easily, that's it.
Exactly. And so at that moment, Boeing offers a plane. So actually the 737 MAX, which is better than the old 737, but still not on the same level as the 320. In open sources, you can find that per passenger, a fully loaded plane, a 737 consumes about 10 to 15% more than an A320. And so that's a huge economic problem for airlines because there's a lot of competition among airlines. There are a lot of them. And so they are forced to have a really tight cost base, bare minimum. And when you look at the cost base of an airline, roughly speaking, if you take a 737, normally, roughly speaking, you're going to do 3 flights a day. You're going to charge about $200 per ticket per day. You're going to fill it to between 80 and 90%. So let's say 85%.
Of plane occupancy?
Plane occupancy, that's it. And with that, plus a bit of cargo, a bit of in-flight product sales, you'll make $100,000 a day, maybe a bit more, let's say between 100 and 120. So that's going to make $40 million in annual revenue. On top of that, you'll have costs, so about 33% for payroll, meaning pilots, flight attendants, and so on. You'll have to pay for maintenance and airport gates. That will cost about 15% of your revenue. You'll have about 10% that will be for the depreciation of the aircraft, so around 3 to 4 million per year. So you have an aircraft worth 50 to 60 million, you depreciate it over 15 years, that's 3 million per year. And you have the kerosene, which will be about 25% of your revenue. So if you have a difference of 10 to 15% on the kerosene, that makes
2 extra percentage points.
Well, there you go. You had kerosene costing you 10 million per year. 10 to 15%, that's $1 to $1.5 million. 10 to 15%, that's a difference of $1 to $1.5 million or euros per year. And that's worth it. The airline that's going to buy it, when they buy, they're going to compare the 737 to the 320. They're going to say, I want a discount because it's going to cost me more to operate, so I'm going to ask for a discount between 5 and 8 million, let's say, between 5 and 10 times the difference in performance. In my opinion, it's probably closer to 5 than to 10. And so at that point, Boeing is in a weak position because actually for the same plane, roughly the same cost base, the same effort, to produce, they sell a plane that has a selling price that is 10 to 15%
lower. That means they had to cut their margin to stay competitive against the new version of the Airbus?
Exactly. So what happened is that when McNerney, the chief executive officer between 2005 and 2015, made that decision, and then Willenberg came in 2015, he said, I'm going to make a hardcore cost-cutting plan. So he lays off 20,000 people, shuts down factories, renegotiates with subcontractors. Basically, they try to cut costs everywhere. And all that is so at first, the market loved it. In fact, Boeing's stock skyrocketed in 2018. And then until the arrival of the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system problem in 2019. And the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system problem, in fact, they cut corners everywhere.
So let's just recall the problem with the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system. It was that at the time, since the engine was no longer centered in the same place, in certain flight configurations, especially with a high angle of attack during takeoff, with strong thrust, with the landing gear and flaps extended, in certain conditions, the control column force was no longer realistic. That is, normally, when a pilot pulls 10 centimeters, it should be 10 kilograms, 20 centimeters, 20 kilograms. The numbers are wrong, so there was no longer that proportionality. At 10 centimeters, it was 5 kilograms. At 20 centimeters, 25 kilograms, so it was wrong. But the pilot, for a Boeing, has to know the weight of his control stick. It gives him an indication, and to give back a reliable indication of the control stick's weight, they actually used aerodynamic force that pushed on the trim tab. But the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, since it was based on a single sensor, actually it was triggered at an inappropriate time, to say the least. And so that caused these 2 catastrophic accidents because the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system was poorly designed from the start.
We agree that the fundamental cause is that, in fact, they tried to push a 737 design too far, and that it created a chain of problems later on, generate a chain of problems later. So there, in 2019, the FAA, the American authorities, say you stop the production of the MAX, then coronavirus disease hits, and so Boeing's commercial production drops. In 2018, we were at 800 planes, and we dropped to 150. In 2020, with a brief period in between, around 500 in 2019, Then COVID hits, so it goes back up until 2023, and in 2023, we start having problems in the production chain, fuselage issues, especially with Spirit Aerosystems, and then we get to 2024.
Specifically, the fuselage wasn't exactly the right shape to fit with the parts next to it. That's exactly it. That's problematic.
That's problematic. And then the big accident was at the beginning of 2024, the Alaska Airlines flight, where a door was torn off during the flight. It could have been a very serious accident. If it had happened at 30,000 feet, there probably would have been fatalities.
All of that is quality control?
It's quality control, but what happened is really serious. Because actually it's a MAX 9 that was produced in 2023, so it's not a plane from 20 years ago. Actually, there was a problem with what we call traveled work. That means the fuselage was coming from Spirit Aero, from their factory in Wichita, and actually it wasn't completely finished. But to produce faster, they still sent it to the Boeing factories in Renton, I think. And at that point, the plane arrives at the station where normally there are things that should have already been done and aren't done yet, so they do them later. And there, someone removed bolts from the door, we don't know who, and they didn't put them back. And when we looked for the documentation, because normally in aviation everything is very, very regulated since it's dangerous, every time we do something, we have to keep a record. When the regulator came and said, show me who worked, etc., we couldn't find the documentation.
But really, they had no traceability of who was working, on which plane, with which bolt, on which door, or maybe they destroyed them to hide it. That, I don't know, but in
fact, I don't really care.
Yes, that's for sure.
As a potential shareholder, either it's criminal or you had documentation and you destroyed it. So it's extremely serious. Either you don't have a process, and that's extremely serious too. So in any case...
In both cases, it's very serious. And how come this quality control is so degraded compared to the standards we have? I don't know. Airbus, it's not as bad. At least on the surface, we don't hear about as many problems.
That's a good question.
Between the 1,000 metal meshes in the tanks, there are pieces of tape that get left behind.
The doors.
There are things, an accumulation over years on different planes as well.
Yes, and then there was even Qatar Airways in 2012 who complained because they found beer cans in the technical area. It's not a completely isolated problem. I don't know exactly. But in any case, what we can say is that in the relationship society has with its workforce, it's clearly problematic. It's problematic in Seattle. Because actually, if we take the 787, there are two production lines for the 787, that is Everett in Seattle, and they made a second one in North Charleston, South Carolina. And the idea was that in North Charleston, they would have a workforce that would be less unionized. Well, they have problems with their unionized workforce in Seattle, and they try to create a bit of a power dynamic. Well, things haven't been going well with their workforce for a long time. And well, that's potentially one of the reasons. And the second reason is also possibly COVID. It's that COVID in the United States wasn't experienced the same way as in Europe. There were a lot of people who were laid off.
They fired a lot of people. They
fired a lot of people, and not everyone came back. Far from it. And so when that happens, you lose qualified people, highly qualified, with a lot of experience. And after that, it takes a very long time to retrain them. It's very, very complicated.
So if we take a little perspective over a few decades, as a result, we end up offering planes that in the end require more work hours than expected. For example, I'm thinking of the KC-46.
They looked at their short-term interest, the company's short-term interest, at the expense of their client's interest, which was the United States Air Force, who wanted and deserved a better product.
Then there are difficulties, development problems that cause accidents, which means that hundreds of thousands of engineer hours are needed to fix the errors.
I would say a strategic mistake in 2011. For me, Boeing's big fundamental mistake was not making a completely new plane in 2011 in the short-haul sector. And that's partly where all the current problems come from.
But was it due to a lack of engineering availability, or was it a choice not to invest? No.
It's a management decision that didn't want to put 15 billion on the table to develop a new plane. It's short-term thinking. We don't want to invest.
You were talking earlier about this philosophy they inherited from McDonnell Douglas. That's one of the consequences.
Potentially, it's difficult to
say it's the fault of the
former McDonnell Douglas people. But what we hear in the industry is that the former McDonnell Douglas people have kind of taken over, and they were kind of schemers, a bit withdrawn. When it came to quality control, they worked less.
Well, it was financiers against an engineering company.
You could say it was kind of like that. That's an accusation
that we often hear, saying that
McDonnell Douglas, they were financiers. Yes, the management probably.
The perspectives.
It's very nasty financier. You have to be careful.
We know it, the bankers, the fans. Faced with that Airbus, we know that despite everything, they're not in a completely green situation either. Their results are certainly good, certainly better than Boeing, but they're not as dazzling as their order book. They have an incredible order book, and yet their revenues, their annual results are not as positive. No, but...
So, well, first of all, there are the problems from the 2000s, so the A380 and the 400M. In terms of engineering and production, I think they've largely solved them. The A350 went very well. It could have gone very badly. That's where Airbus has problems. More recently, actually, in the 2010s and 2020s, the big story for both Boeing and Airbus was ramping up production. Roughly, they were making about 30 planes a month on short-haul routes at the beginning of the 2010s. And they both went up to 50. In any case, that was the goal. And now Airbus is talking about 75. So those are still production rate increases that are hard to maintain. Especially since, once again, these are airplanes, they can't crash. So you really have to do your job well. And I think that Airbus had really achieved a good result in 2019. And COVID caused a lot of problems for Airbus because it created many issues in the supply chain with the subcontractors. And that Airbus doesn't completely control. So there are actually two theories. There's the first theory, which would be favorable to Airbus, which would be to say that it's not their fault, it's the subcontractor's fault. And there's the second theory, which says that the two big ones, Boeing and Airbus, put too much pressure on the subcontractors during the years 2010 to 2020. And what's true is that, in fact, we see it every time Airbus says they want to go up to 75 per month. The chief financial officer of Safran, well, the chief financial officer of Safran says, 65, that would already be very good. Because, in fact, they have to make investments, and it's not Airbus who does them, it's the subcontractor who does them. Based on promises of production rates that won't necessarily be met, that are reasonable, that are possible. But from the subcontractor's point of view, it means they have to put in money right away. And then I'm not absolutely sure that I'll get the orders. So there's a kind of tension that's intrinsic. It's the nature of the business. But you see, I think Airbus's problem since the end of COVID in ramping up production is that the increase is actually quite slow. So they were at 860 commercial aircraft in 2019, and they dropped to 500, 550 or 560 in 2020. And after that, they went back up by 50 per year. Last year, they did 766. They thought they would do 800. There was an engine problem with the LIP. And there, next year, we'll see where it leads. But we're waiting for 825, and we're expecting more than 1,000 in 2027. But the question is, will the supply chain, will the chain of suppliers be able to handle this kind of volume?
That's the problem, especially since the market balance apparently tends to lean toward bus. Notably, thanks to the 321 XLR, which is a plane that gives a competitive advantage with no rival, there they have a monopoly. TIC on the single aisle, very long-haul planes. So then what happens to this balance? No.
But here, we always come back to that story from 2011. If Boeing wanted to potentially, because actually the A321 is already an extended version of the A320. So basically, we have a single aisle plane, but it's longer, so we can fit more passengers. So when we redo the calculations we talked about earlier, it brings in more revenue. In the end, there's an operational lever. Airline's margin, which is very important. And here we're really pushing it to the maximum to make the 321 XLR. It can go very far, for a single aisle. And so it's a very good plane for airlines. And there I looked at last year's orders for Airbus. There are about 650 single aisle orders. And out of those, there are 500 orders for the 321. So that's what they publish. And what I'm being told is that actually, in the orders for the 321, there are plenty of airlines that have swapped their orders from the regular 321 to the XLR, and that there would be 550 orders for the XLR. Well, I'm not sure about that, but that's what I was told, that there were 550 orders for the XLR last year.
So, in other words, the
XLR commercially, it's a huge success. It's
the new best of.
And they're Boeing anyway. Actually, they have the MAX 8 and the MAX 9, which are certified, but with today's production volume capped at 38 by the FAA, they think they'll be at 50 per month in 2026. The market thinks they'll be at 50 per month in 2027 instead. To compete with it, they also brought out their 737. Yet here they're really pushing it to the max.
The max?
It's the MAX 10, but it's not certified today.
The certification time between the first and the last version is starting to reach the maximum limits, in theory. So he should start all over again. He should go back to zero. There's also the 777X, which we still haven't seen arrive.
They announced it in 2013. They are supposed to enter airline service in 2020. And now it's supposed to be imminent. But at least I'm told it could potentially be pushed back to 2026. In comparison, the 330neo was announced in 2014. So in this case, it's Airbus that responded to Boeing, and it started flying in 2018. But the 330neo, they just changed the engine. On the 777X, they were too greedy because they made a huge engine, and then they changed the wings. And with the wings and so I think they wanted to make something a bit too complicated. Well, we'll see when it goes into production. But in the meantime, I mean, 13 years between the first flight and the announcement is way too long.
Yeah, it's too long. So if we take a step back, strategy.
Yes.
Strengths and weaknesses of each of them. The outlook, because on top of that, we haven't talked about it yet. But economically, Boeing's results have just been published, and they're not exactly great. There was their strike last year that cost them, I don't know how many billions, 7 billion. Yes, no.
But it was really I hope we've hit the lowest point, because in the fourth quarter, they were dealing with production issues because of the COVID peak strike. And every week it cost $1 billion. So 7 weeks of strike cost $7 billion. They did a capital increase of 21 billion. So that's a good idea, because it will already fill the gap. Well, it dilutes the shareholders, but that's life. So now we think they're going to burn about 4 billion this year. And normally things should get better starting in 2026. I think the problem for Boeing now is that we forget about strategy for the moment. What they need is to be able to produce their planes, for their planes to be of good quality and for them to fly. And for the next 12 to 18 months, that's all that's being asked of them.
But still, there isn't really a way out. If he stays in the current situation, there's the loss of market share on medium-haul flights. That Airbus is starting to enter the cargo market, where Boeing had 80% of the cargo market with a 350 freighter that's doing well. What perspective, if there is one?
The perspective is that they still have a significant order book. They still have clients who want to stay with them. And there's the new generation that's eventually going to arrive, because actually the Neo and Max generation, now it's already 10 years old after all. And we're talking about a new generation. Safran, they are in the process of, for
2035?
Yes, 2035, we're halfway across. So what we need is for them to manage to hold on for a few years. And then we move on to a new generation. And the day we move on to a new generation, all the cards are reshuffled. Because in that case, they can start over with a plane, a blank slate, and then there won't be these problems of a plane that's too short-legged. There will still be strategic choices to make. Each time you can't mess up these strategic choices. So yeah, I would say a tough strategy, just barely getting by for a few years. And then after that, we start from scratch for the new generation.
And Airbus increasing margins again with a Boeing that keeps selling at very, very low prices. It's doable.
So the margins, because actually the problem with this industry is that airlines have extremely low margins. So pushing prices on a customer who doesn't have money is always very complicated.
It's around 5%, let's remember, apart from Ryanair, which is at 15 to 20%. Overall, Victoria is more like 5%.
Yes, it's 5%. And actually, as soon as one of them makes a lot of profit, immediately, all the competitors come in to put a flight exactly in parallel. In the end, your profit margin gets eaten up quickly. So it's hard for Airbus to raise prices, even with Boeing in trouble. No, in my opinion, what can work for Airbus to increase its margins is to be very, very good operationally. To have an economy of scale, for starters. Because if they deliver between 60 and 75 A321s per month, we're going to start seeing a pretty significant economy of scale. And then we can expect quite decent, quite respectable margins at Airbus.
Well, in any case, they both need to be strong before the Chinese arrive. Yes, well, the Chinese, we'll see. We'll talk about it next time.
For now, the COMAC is flying. So what that means is that CFM makes the engine for the COMAC. We're talking about volumes that are good for me. It's not in the right market segment. The COMAC, it's on the 319, and Airbus doesn't have any more orders for the 319.
But that will close off part of the Chinese market, which was still important.
Which was important, but actually is much less so now. And besides, it's only certified in China. For now, in that segment, I'm not very worried about the competition, but maybe later.
That will be the generation for 2035, we'll see. They would have to
know how to make engines. There's
still work to do.
No, but the Chinese are good. But in this segment, I think for now, we don't see them coming yet.
Personally, I think they're putting all their engineers on military planes. That's why they have a bit less available to develop civilian planes. That's likely. Nicolas, thank you very much. We'll include all the links so people can check it out, including the YouTube channel and all the info to follow you. Thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you very soon at the Air and Cosmos studio.